Thank you very much, Caitlin. And I can't believe it. We are right on time. And we have some time available for a discussion. But first, I wanted to share Luigi De Martino's answers to Rodrigo's questions because I think you are offline, Luigi. Hello? No, Luigi? So I will share with you Luigi's response, Rodrigo, and then I will open the floor if that's okay with you. Yes. Um, Luigi wanted to say that you are correct, Dr. Guerrero, to highlight the question of illicit arms versus licit ones. You are also correct to say that at the end, a homicide is a homicide. So it does not matter that much if a person has been killed with a licit or with an illicit arm. As he said, Luigi, the ultimate measure of the success will be a measurable reduction of violence, firearms-related violence specifically. You also highlighted, Rodrigo, the question of measurement, saying that thanks to WHO, there is a better measure of homicide. It is correct that data on lethal violence has improved a lot over the past 10 years, especially in regions such as Latin America that are really at the forefront of this progress, not only with national data, but also with city-level data. At the same time, other regions are not that developed, and when dealing with non-lethal forms of violence, there is a lot of progress that remains to be done. Looking at measurement, we would need also to focus on improving data disaggregation, not only by sex, age, and location, but also by the instrument of violence. In terms of tracing, we do agree. Here, however, the global commitment related to 16.4 will be useful to improve practices on tracing, and hopefully we'll see more states submitting tracing requests to producers and having answers from producers. And finally, you criticize the timid language. Timid language is sometimes the result of fierce diplomatic fights, and SDG 16 has been the object of many debates. At the end of the day, targets like 16.1 on reducing deaths, as well as 16.4 on reducing illicit arms flow, do have strong enough language to act. The question will be how states will want and be able to act. This is also where local actors like cities, as well as civil society, can help in reminding states of their commitments and in helping them find solutions. Cities like Cali, Medellin, or Bogota have all shown that action is possible to reduce violence in a measurable way, including firearms-related violence. All the best to all of us from Luigi De Martino, and thanks, Luigi. And I would like to open the floor for us for discussion, if anyone wants to take the lead. Everyone wants to go home. No, not everyone.
Is the microphone working?
Please.
Okay, I'm Peter Nye at the Administration for Community Living. Thanks a lot for your presentations and your remarks. Very, very informative. Maybe you might have talked about this before I arrived, so please apologize if I'm asking a question you've already answered. I'm concerned about the use of 3D printers when it comes to weapons, because I'm concerned that even if everyone had the sort of best possible protections against smuggling and trafficking, people would be able to use 3D printers to print weapons that never got smuggled or trafficked. Anyway, if you would, again, I apologize if you've already addressed this, but if you haven't, I would like to hear opinions about this issue.
Thank you. Actually, we have not spoken of 3D printers to print guns, but maybe our law enforcement officers or our techies here can comment. Sheldon, please, if you might.
I'd be happy to talk. I'd be happy to talk to you offline about that because it's complex. The National Center for Criminal Justice Technology Research, Test, and Evaluation has looked at this closely, and there's more myth and assumptions and hype about it than there is reality. I'll share that with you later.
Okay, stop by my table and give me your business card, please.
Sure.
Well, I'd like to discuss that issue with you, okay?
You bet.
Thank you very much. The floor is open for other participants. If you are on the web, you can send us your email. Please, Andres, and then
Yeah, just to
Evelyn.
reiterate something that Mayor Guerrero said before, addressing the producers of firearms. It is interesting to see that at the global level, framing a problem, for example, the illicit drugs, is focused a lot on the producers and not so much on the consumers, while guns is focused mostly on the consumers, and there's very little on the producers. While the efforts that were discussed here are really important and certainly an advance to where we were before June 2001, when this sort of started, I think there's still a huge lack of information and of highlighting the role of the producers. We have some really good examples from health, for example, with the tobacco industry, in taking them to task on their responsibility on the problem that affect so many people with their products. Yet there's very little in regards to producers of firearms. Just wanted to highlight that point, as it is a huge omission in the usual international discourse.
Thank you, Andres. And I would like to add that information from the Office for Government Accountability here in the States estimates that 40% of U.S. arms dealers, for example, depend on illegal trade with Mexico and developing countries for their subsistence. No, so most of the trade and the production of weapons is completely out of control, and I think that is one of the key issues, as Rodrigo was saying, that we should tackle. Thank you, Andres. And now, Jacqueline Campbell, please, and then Evelyn Tomaszewski.
Thank you very much for the presentations, and I'm ecstatic I got back in time to hear you, Arturo. I was afraid maybe I would not.
Thank you.
And when I think about that, the notion of your organization against impunity, and I was struck by, the number of crimes unreported in Mexico, and know that in the issues of gender-based violence, violence against women, child abuse, in terms of how much there is even more so unreported crimes. And when we talk to women from other countries and women who come into our country, who are immigrants, and we talk to them about any collaboration with the criminal justice sector, and they're like, well, either it's not illegal, especially domestic violence, gender-based violence, or even where it's illegal, that the criminal justice system is not a partner, either will not act or is actively hostile and abusive toward the person who's trying to report a rape, a sexual assault, any kind of violence against women. And yet, at least in this country, the criminal justice system is almost punitive when it's not reported. There's certain access to things, to a U visa, to a sexual assault, not the exam, but to go forward in many conditions unless you have reported to criminal justice. And I do a lot of work in this country with criminal justice, and I'm not trying to, make a problem. I'm not trying to impugn a system. But I do know that there's a lot of injustices, not only gender injustice, but also, like in this country, if you're white, you never go to jail for domestic violence. If you're black, you often go to jail for domestic violence. And there's those other injustices that compound the issue. And I guess I don't have as much of a question as just a commentary on that. And we used to think back, 20 years ago when we did the WHO study that, it would be so important for countries to pass a law against domestic violence. And a lot of countries have. But that is just a teeny tiny piece of what needs to be done in terms of changing norms and responses. Because if the criminal justice sector is not in there, and the difficulties in many countries with actually bringing charges of rape, the different systems that you have to go through, et cetera, and so forth. And I just don't want us to forget the criminal justice system. It has been a powerful ally here in the United States in terms of addressing domestic violence. But at the same time, we not only need to address impunity, we need to think about impunity for who, and we need to think about the many complicated piece layering of that issue. Just as I said, a commentary, something to put on the table.
Okay. Thank you, Jacqueline. Now let's hear Evelyn's comments.
Thank you. That was a wide-reaching panel. It's just really, so I think I have two questions. One is...
You can only make one, then you have to take your other turn.
Okay.
Just kidding.
So this hat, this hat asks, we talked in our debrief from our lunchtime group discussions, we talked a lot about silos and how do we really build collaborations. And, the SDGs, there are many groups and many folks advocating, engaging on, promoting and ensuring that their thinking, their content is built into the SDGs. And so I'm looking at I think it was Luigi who mentioned, but a couple as well, building regional and global partnerships to support national efforts. I wrote down his words. In terms of really looking at what I think is gun trafficking, that might be my words, but the idea of really working with regionally to stop the flow of arms, not only to count what we find, and to work with multi-level stakeholders. Similarly, language similarly used by Susan in her presentation of building stakeholders and finding who our colleagues in the good work is. And then when Kaylin spoke, you're looking at programs and laws that address inequality, and in my sense, they've opened the door, particularly in the United States, but in other countries, to then tease out and further who is addressed by those laws. For example, we see in the United States the expansion to address lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender persons' access to anti-violence protections, etc. How do we engage this? I think I'm getting to my question. How do we engage those diverse communities to see that we really have to connect to work on this together? How do we engage the communities who are working on human rights, promoting human rights, who are working with LGBT community, who are working in gun violence or against gun violence? How do we really build those partnerships from what you've talked about and beyond it? I think so. That's my easy question.
Thank you. Ladies first.
I'll first respond to Jackie's comment. Would you like everyone to hear me?
Turn it on. It's for the...
Apologies, virtual audience and recorded audience. So first responding to Jackie's comment about policy versus implementation, and particularly when it comes to gender violence and getting law enforcement and the criminal justice sector to be allies. takes a lot of work and, well, to say the least, of course, but I think really in the case of the development sector, it's working directly with law enforcement agencies and officials on the ground, doing norms change trainings with them, building their capacity to provide trauma-informed responses as well. So it's slow, long, hard work because it requires connecting what the legal system has on paper to then how the folks who are meant to be the arbiters and enforcers of those laws to change the norms that they grew up with as well. A couple examples in Nepal, UNDP country team working closely with law enforcement on LGBT rights and really making sure that new legislation, historic legislation to acknowledge the rights of LGBT populations are then understood by law enforcement, and that means countering homophobic treatment by law enforcement. And so it's on the ground work that is slow but needed. And a great example in the US on that context is for campus sexual assault, working with law enforcement officials on college campuses on a campus basis to understand this is how you handle a report of sexual assault from a student. And so it's really that question of policy versus implementation and requiring holding the hands of the people who enforce the laws, person by person, unit by unit. And then quickly just responding to the great point from Evelyn about really building partnerships across movements. For UNDP, it's, and Vicki can speak to this for USAID, it's really, moving from what was gender mainstreaming to now moving to gender violence mainstreaming and having folks at all sectors of development, from climate change to peace building and democratic governance, folks who wouldn't see themselves as typically working in violence prevention, to really recognize that inevitably the populations and individuals who they're going to be working with on their projects will be impacted by violence at some point in their lives. And so having the capacity to respond to survivors and also understanding at the same time that the success of their projects will be undermined without addressing violence issues. But Susan, you can speak really well. Better than anyone, I'm sure, on partnerships.
Only lessons learned. Thanks. I think those are really good responses. I also wanted Jacqueline just to comment, and this is just very brief, but based on the experience that we've had around legal reform as it relates to violence in childhood, and I know I'm speaking to the partnership specifically, but I think one of the most important things we can do, and as we continue to advocate for the right kinds of law reform, are creating processes of law reform, not a couple of guys in a room writing up a law. And the most illustrative example of this right now, I think, although it's now becoming historic, but the Verma Commission in India after the gang rapes. And just watching that whole, I mean, I know lots more stuff has to happen, but there's a more vibrant public discourse on that issue that's connected to the law reform process. And I think that where we do see law reform as a process we also see it as a process of social change and public discourse. So I just wanted to say that because our advocacy, I think, has to be more than just getting the law on the books. And I know that's certainly not what you were saying. Evelyn, to your questions and comment about regional and other collaboration, I think we have a rough road to hoe ahead of us because we have all been trained. And I'm going to just move from Kaylin's language of projects and interventions to the fact that the Sustainable Development Agenda calls for much more national ownership and national leadership, and it's not the old agenda that we've had. And I think that's going to be a real challenge because we're all trained in our siloed issues, and we're all trained in the development assistance language, and And I'm seeing it already in the partnership, and it's just, we've got this motto, check your logos and your egos at the door, harder than it looks. And somehow we have to raise people's and institutions' confidence levels that we're all going to make improvements. All the things we want to address are going to improve. I've been told not to use this expression. I'm going to use it anyway. All ships will rise. Apparently, that's colonial. But this idea that by being in this together, we can have greater success. The one thing I wanted to mention is that the Agenda 2030 is also meant to be a state-led process, but not only. And I'm thinking of my colleagues over here and the conversations about the work in the Northern Triangle. We also know that there are a number of places where that's not going to work for lots of reasons. And so we're going to be, it's a balancing act. I mean, we're already, the criticism about the Pathfinder concept, for example, is, we have two or three countries contiguous in Latin America where putting all of this in the hands of government when we're talking about state-led violence it is not going to work the same way. So we're coming up with some guidance and thinking about how you work more with civil society, even knowing it's still a sovereign government. They're still member states, so we have to satisfy that. But I think that's going to be a huge a challenge, but an opportunity. And then finally, I think it's going to be so important that where we have a SARC, where we have an African Union, where we have a European Union, that we're really making the most of those entities and the leadership that they provide in those regions. And so to conclude from my side, in terms of this global partnership, it's not about a group sitting in New York or Geneva. It's about the partners on the ground driving the agenda. And that brings me full circle to social norms change, which is that it happens from the inside out. It doesn't happen from out here somewhere. And I see you nodding, everybody's experienced at this, but I think that as we think about social norm change and that, where are we behind the scenes and underneath, enabling and supporting.
Thank you, Susan, and what a vibrant discussion. I wanted to add some thoughts, and I think as Molly Elgin was discussing today, just the fact that sustainable development at this level of looking at the deeper causes has goals and targets is unique, and she talked about the 4 Ps. Focusing on people, on the planet, on prosperity and peace and partnership and working together. It sounds beautiful. I think Albert Einstein would celebrate that humanity and science are coming together here at the National Academies to prevent violence and to promote sustainable development. But these challenges, I think part of the group and part of this forum could be up to the task in helping them and in providing support for this need in the world of creating a workforce. And throughout the last 7 or 8 years of this forum, there is enough knowledge and there is enough discussion here where if we are able to synthesize it and to translate these findings, we could definitely provide support for the prevention community out there and to improve the delivery of prevention services throughout the world. So it's very good to have Agenda 2030 and Objective 17, which calls upon us to build effective delivery mechanisms as organizations. And finally, my thought throughout these last couple of years and today is this group and the violence prevention community have put forth some very important principles that are being taken a whole and moved forward. And I think the ecological perspective that we have time and time again revised with the life course framework is permeating now at all agencies. And this ecological framework with a life course focus is integration. It talks about integration. It talks about a systemic view of these problems that humanity is facing, and it gives us important tools to address them. So thank you all very much. We're still open, but I don't see any more participants. Oh, there you go, Vicky. Please, I'm sorry.
Just a couple of comments again. Thank you, Arturo, and thank you to all of you for your contributions. It was a really rich panel and discussions. I think I had some of the same observations as Jackie in terms of the impunity and the violence against women. So I won't repeat that, but I did have some very similar observations in that regard. In terms of also just to think about when you're thinking about what the costs are of violence against women, similar to what you pointed out, Arturo, in terms of the GDP costs, we also know that in many countries, when you look at the costs of violence against women against their own GDPs, they can also, globally, we know that GDP costs about the world 5% of global GDP, violence against women or gender-based violence. And then countries have varying ranges that can go up to over 10% of costs. So those are important things to consider when we're looking at those types of issues. And then understanding that quite often those systems are broken in terms of, or not broken, but not quite functioning well when we have all those nice laws on the books and the implementation isn't quite going right. And impunity and how that continues to drive violence because there's no response. Really something that we're kind of trying to look at is, what is an appropriate community level response in that space while we're getting all of those things up and running. And so really going back to your communities that you're working with and how are they defining success in those spaces and really looking to communities for that. And we are looking at GBV mainstreaming in USAID, as Kaylin mentioned. It's kind of our next, it's part of one of our key outcomes of our gender equality and female empowerment policy. And I think people are less sure of how gender-based violence prevention and response is a hindrance to the development outcomes that we're looking for. And so that's something that we're working on and getting people more comfortable and understanding what that is. One more point and one more question. So, Kaylin, I just wanted to recognize that UNDP has done some really interesting and important research on looking at men's attitudes around gender-based violence in Asia, the Asia region. And so that gets at understanding what are those norms. From the male perspective, we often only focus on understanding women's experience of violence. And so that's really important work that we're doing, that we need to understand kind of what's going on with men so that we can have a holistic approach. And Arturo, I wanted to ask you about, in the work that you're doing, which is so important, are you guys looking at, in terms of, bribes, the International Association of Women Judges is looking at, they're naming sextortion or transactional sex for, bartering for different things. So, whether it's to get an outcome in court or whether to achieve a public, good that is deserved to them. I didn't know if you guys are also looking at either sextortion or transactional sex in terms of a type of bribery in Mexico. So thank you all.
Thank you, Vicky. Please, if there's comments.
I think I have a question.
Okay. Don't worry. Let me. I think the fight against corruption and impunity is clearly needs to start in the judicial system. I think it requires a thorough cleaning. There is so much impunity in the most of the fields, but if this begins with the courts and with the court system and with the judicial system, it's clear that you need to start fixing things there. And what we are in the organization, Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity, we are aware that this effort is probably going to take 30 or 40 years to begin to change the core indicators that we are worried about. But we're glad to be starting it. You point out to specific action areas that need to be addressed. So thank you. Please, Caitlin. Microphone.
One thought did occur to me because I appreciate Vicky bringing up the work that UNDP's Asia Regional Office in Bangkok did on studying norms around male perpetration of violence because it really connects to a lot of the themes that we've touched on in this discussion, and particularly the work that Susan is spearheading. One of the main findings of that study was that men who showed the least remorse towards perpetrating violence against a female partner as an adult had also the highest self-reported rates of abuse or witnessing abuse as children. So really that continuum of exposure and victimization feeding into perpetration in later life. And secondly, that there are some norms changes that are happening slowly but surely in terms of attitudes of remorse for rape for someone who is a partner outside the context of marriage. But sadly, we have a long way to go in terms of building understandings of agency and bodily autonomy with regards to in marriage. So that study showed that men who were married and raped their spouses did not show remorse for that perpetration of violence. And that's not a huge surprise, actually, in the United States. As late as the early 2000s, South Carolina was the last state to make legal on their books marital rape. So we have a long way to go, but things are improving.
Susan, please.
I can't resist then, having made that comment, that I think you've actually hit on something that's been a constant theme through our discussions, even starting yesterday, about what neuroscience tells us about early childhood experiences of violence, whether you're a girl or a boy or another gender identity. And so what a ready-made, place to really do more than we're doing already. So I really think you've raised an incredibly important point.
So thank you all very much. We will be finishing the day for today, wrapping up, and welcome tomorrow. We will expect you as of 9 a.m. for the forum beginning. Enjoy the rest of the evening in Washington. Thank you very much.
For tomorrow, the breakfast will be at 8:30. So if
Okay.
you want to eat, get here a little early. We'll start promptly at 9. We have a very packed agenda tomorrow morning. I want to thank everybody for participating today, especially our webcast audience, which stayed with us. I want to really give a special thanks to our great presenters, and again, the team that put this together. We have to stay on schedule, which cuts a lot of the conversations. Several of us wanted to ask the three of you what we can do as a forum to help you. But we'll have to get to that tomorrow when we have open discussion time toward the end. So I look forward to seeing all of you bright and early. Thank you for today.